Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Best Games, period. I'm your host, Jack Gardner, and with me is no one, because I'm by myself, and this week is going to be an honorable mention. We did have something else planned for this week, but just some plans kind of fell through because of emergencies and family emergencies. Hope everybody's okay. In place of what we were going to do, which was Wolfenstein: The New Order, we're going to be doing an honorable mention for the game Stellaris. And I'm actually very excited that I get to do this because I've wanted to talk about Stellaris for a long time. But on the podcast, we kind of have this, it's not like a hard rule, but just to kind of make things a little bit more interesting and make sure we aren't kind of leaping to any conclusions about a game. We want the game, any game we talk about on the podcast, to be over a year old. We don't want to kind of be dazzled by it. We want some time to have kind of passed and have some reflection on the qualities of a game, and before we decide whether or not this should be considered perhaps one of the best games, period, or at the very least be nominated for an honorable mention as something that's really, really good, but maybe not quite on the level of best games, period. And that's kind of where I put Stellaris. I think Stellaris is this really fantastic 4X strategy game. And if you aren't really familiar with what exactly a 4X strategy might be, it's this term that was coined in the early 90s, I believe for the game Master of Orion, in a review, either a review preview, I'm not 100% sure. But it's this term that is basically short for explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. And it's kind of the different ways empire building and growth can kind of pursue power. And it's become kind of one of the pinnacles of larger political strategy games. It's the kind of gameplay that gave rise to Civilization. Not Civilization as a real world concept, but I mean Civilization, the game series by Sid Meier. But oh, sorry, I have a little bug in my throat this week, so I might sound a little bit rough at times, but I assure you, I am okay. I'm just a little bit, might sound a little bit different. 4X games have to maintain a really good balance between strategy and, planning. And so, for example, if you have the pace of the game set too fast and it's set in real time, then you have something that's more like Age of Empires or StarCraft, and that's not really conducive to kind of these long, prolonged, grand strategy games that 4X traditionally gravitates towards. Not that StarCraft and Age of Empires are bad. I'm sure we'll talk about those on this podcast at some point. But traditionally 4X is kind of more like if you adapted Risk or Axis and Allies into video game form. They tend to take a long time, whereas a StarCraft game, you can finish that up in like 30 minutes, or less, sometimes. Zerg Rush. But Stellaris is neat because it strikes a fine balance with its real-time gameplay, where you have multiple speeds. You can set it to slow, you can pause it, you can have it at normal speed, or you can go fast or fastest. And basically it is divided into, I suppose, what you could consider turns. Each month of in-game time is one turn, and at the end of each month you get a new influx of resources depending on how much your empire is generating, that you can do more stuff with. And so things tend to move at this slow pace, but it's like the perfect pace because it allows you to make decisions and kind of deliberate and take time and figure out maybe what the best course of action might be for your empire. And that's not easy to do. There are some games that get that wrong and are just way too slow to be interesting, and then there are games that just kind of take it a little bit too fast, and this hits just the right balance. And I'm spending a lot of time talking about that, but on top of that, there's just a whole lot of flexibility in Stellaris. Because you can actually, like, there are a bunch of pre-made empires, and I've got to be honest, I've never played as any of those. Every time I've played Stellaris, I've made my own race of creatures, my own empire, because there's this very robust civilization creator, and you can create what kind of alien species you want it to be. Like, I think you can choose from, like, sentient fungus, like bird creatures, they're like weird divergent forms of mammals, like all kinds of different things. Like at one point, I think one of my favorite creatures that I made in Stellaris was these beautiful kind of elf-like creatures that were a hive mind. And not only were they a hive mind, but they were what the game calls a devouring swarm. And so they're basically these immortal elf creatures that look beautiful, but any civilization they take over, they literally devour. Like, they eat the other races that they take over, which, as you can imagine, does not make many friends in diplomacy. You can't negotiate with other empires or anything like that, but you do have other benefits as being a hive mind, and specifically as being a devouring swarm. Those all give you their own benefits, so maybe you don't need diplomacy. And that's kind of one of the great things, like how you construct your empire affects how you play the game. And so you can play as essentially like these immortal creatures, but it does take a very, very long time to make more of those creatures to, populate a planet. Or you can, have these creatures that live very short lifespans but reproduce very fast. Or you can have, you can set up like a democracy or a kingdom, like a monarchy. You can have many, many different forms of government, autocracy, all that stuff, communist. And each one of those leaderships leads to different kinds of gameplay. Like, they confer different benefits and have different drawbacks, and it just affects how you play the game. And so each player starts out with one homeworld, and you have like a few warships, and you have an exploration vessel and a construction vessel. And that's it. And you start out in a galaxy, in an entire galaxy of stars. And you can make that galaxy, like even the smallest galaxies in Stellaris are still huge. Like, hundreds of stars. But on the grand scale, you can have thousands of stars in your galaxy. And obviously not as many stars as exist in an actual galaxy, because that game would literally take forever. But Stellaris gives you basically these several phases of the game. You have the early game, which is much more just kind of exploring and doing your own thing and like finding stuff, seeing what's out in your galaxy, because each game is different. And one of the neat things is that as you explore with your science vessel, you can send it out to scan planets and stuff. And there's a chance it will come across an anomaly. And anomalies are just these random events that you can research and can either hurt you or help you, or present you with a series of decisions to make that can either hurt you or help you. Sometimes it's discovering that there's a special kind of planet and it gives you more science research if you build a station there. Or sometimes it can be like an abandoned alien ship production facility from like 2,000 years ago, and you can try and fix it, and it'll like give you like 3 advanced warships before finally breaking down. Other times it can be like not great. Like you can try and settle on a planet and suddenly discover that, oh, there's a race of mole people that live deep below the surface of the planet, and they're not, maybe depending on how you interact with them, maybe they're not too happy about people settling on the surface. So you have all these different things that can happen, and it keeps that early game interesting. And really, you want to colonize as many planets as possible in that early game, because then you get to the mid-game, and it's probably where the game is its weakest, because in the mid-game you have to kind of rely on diplomacy or warfare to kind of hold your own. And the diplomatic system in Stellaris is not really that interesting. And it can kind of feel arbitrary. Some creatures will love you because their civilization has the xenophilic attribute, which means they love other alien species, and some species will hate you because they're xenophobic, and it's all kind of luck of the draw, but there's not really good ways to overcome those any roadblocks you might encounter. If your borders are clashing and you don't have like a super great diplomatic relationship with one another, it's gonna be bad. So usually you end up having to rely on your navy and your warships. However, what I think makes Stellaris really interesting, and I'm probably saying interesting a lot. Daniel's not here to tell me if I'm saying interesting too much. Dang it, Daniel. Anyway, if you happen to make it through the mid-game, which can take a while, but if you make it through the mid-game and make it more towards the end game, you start seeing a lot of really interesting stuff happen, because they've kind of expanded it over the past year and a half or so. And if you have the Utopia expansion that released, you can actually start building these mega structures, which include like Dyson spheres and ring worlds and like sensor arrays that can sense the entire galaxy, or just like these mini space station moons that effectively act as like second or third planets. You can start building all that stuff, and that is really cool. Like that's really an achievement if you manage to build a functional ring world. And on top of that, you also have stuff like super weapons coming into play. Like you can, and this was not in the expansion. This was just in the base game, but like you can build like these tachyon lances that are essentially these super powerful lasers for your biggest battleships, or these giant mass drivers that are essentially humongous railguns. And those give you a significant edge in combat, which you might need, because one of the neat things that Stellaris does is that in order to shake up the end game, specifically because a lot of 4X games tend to have a snowballing effect on power, where like if one of the civilizations has an edge on the others, it tends to keep that edge and maybe improve it as the game goes forward, and eventually that can lead to a frustrating situation where you're just completely overpowered and there's nothing you can do. Or an enemy is completely overpowered and there's nothing you can do, rather. In order to stop that, there are some interesting, almost fail-safes built into Stellaris, and they're called endgame crises. And those are interesting because I think maybe when Stellaris came out, they were maybe too much of a crisis. Because what happens is that there is the possibility in every game of Stellaris that that an alien civilization will discover robotics, and build up, a robotic workforce to work on planets that they couldn't otherwise colonize. Which sounds like a good idea. Except if they take that research too far, there's a chance that their robotic workforce might become self-aware and form their own empire. And then you have a robotic empire. And robots kind of have a huge advantage in Stellaris in that they can, A, they can live anywhere, and B, they're way better at things typically than organic species are. And so if this robotic empire does happen to form, it might start sending out its programming to other robotic workers around the galaxy and slowly build up this giant robotic network. And then it will start trying to exterminate all organics in the galaxy, which can become a huge problem. So instead of you worrying about a specific empire, you might have to worry about one of these final crises. There's another one where this race of beings from outside of the galaxy invade, and I think they're called the Pretheran Scourge. But they're like these hideous, Cthulhu-type monsters that, infect planets, and if they manage to take over a planet, they just cover it with their Pretheran goo, and it basically becomes uninhabitable. That's something that can happen. Alternatively, an empire can research a dangerous technology, and that might trigger an invasion of extra-dimensional creatures that slowly start invading through rifts in interdimensional rifts. And I think all that is really neat. If you're more of a novice player, that can be really frustrating, especially if you have something really good going on and you're just not prepared for these endgame events. But I happen to think they're pretty fun. There are also some really neat kind of random events that can occur around the galaxy. For example, you might stumble across a space system that has a giant space dragon that lives there, or you might encounter this mysterious fortress from a bygone age that is still active. Or you might find just a weird sphere floating around, or an interdimensional rift that has a gigantic Cthulhu-like worm tentacle that can destroy entire fleets of ships. There are just so many different things out there to uncover, and each time you play the game, it's different. Both depending on what you do and the kind of galaxy you load into. And I find it to be a very refreshing and fun experience. And if you are at all interested in strategy games, I would highly recommend Stellaris. I recognize it's not really for everyone. Some people just aren't super into strategy games, but Paradox Interactive, they really knocked it out of the park with Stellaris. I think it might be... No, it actually is one of their fastest selling games that they've ever created, and for good reason. It's a fun game. And again, maybe not everyone's cup of tea. It does move very slowly. The mid-game can get kind of bogged down, and kind of frustrating, especially if you aren't really good at making friends or abusing the diplomacy system. But for the most part, especially over a year after its release, it's relatively bug-free. A lot of the things have been kind of tweaked and, work better now. And it already worked pretty alright when it released. I would say that if games of Civilization if you feel like they take too long to complete, Stellaris might not be the kind of game you have the patience for, just because, for example, I've played over 300 hours of Stellaris, and probably only finished, 3 or 4 games. No, Not that I haven't played other games. Like, I've played more than those 3 or 4. I just lost or knew I was in a real bad spot and didn't feel like spending hours trying to claw back into the game. But I've probably played like 12 total games and finished 3 or 4 of them. So, take that as you will. Depending on your patience, that's either fine or a total deal breaker, and I get it. That being said, this can be possibly this might even be a game better to tackle with friends if you have a couple friends who are kind of into this kind of game and are willing to, sit down for like once a week on Saturdays or something, and play Stellaris for a few hours. It does have a multiplayer, and the multiplayer is pretty solid. That can help alleviate some of the difficulty in navigating relations with other empires and all that jazz. It helps if you have a friend to either stand by your side or stab you in the back, depending on the kinds of friends you have. So, yeah, that is my honorable mention for Stellaris. I think next week, I'm not entirely sure what we're going to have for you next week. It's going to be a little bit of a surprise, both for you, our listeners, and for me, podcaster, to figure that out. Thank you for everyone who tuned in to Extra Life over the weekend. We had so many people come, like new people come into the Extra Life fold. We had a ton of people. I think last I heard, it might not have even been the final numbers, but we ended like almost $1 million over what we raised on game day last year. So that's hugely amazing. The event I was at raised 10 grand over what they raised last year. So that's amazing too. Like Extra Life, you guys have been knocking it out of the park. Everyone who participates, really. And just keep that going, because it was amazing to see this year. So, remember, you can keep fundraising. You can keep donating until the end of the year for it to count towards 2017. You can do that over on extra-life.org. If you've never heard of Extra Life before, it's basically a part of Children's Miracle Network hospitals. And basically everything you donate goes directly to either, if you're a participant, the hospital of your choice, or if you're just donating, the hospital of whoever you're donating to's choice. Words difficult, talking hard. Anyway, you can do that over on extra-life.org. You can actually even still sign up and have your own little game day event. So, what's stopping you? Go do it. Maybe stream some Stellaris. There's an idea. So that is that. You can also find this very podcast along with just connecting up with other people in the Extra Life community over on community.extra-life.org. You can also find a bunch of different articles about why people participate in Extra Life, what kind of keeps people coming back. You can find articles about video games and board games and all that good stuff. It's a great time. I highly recommend checking it out. And with that, I think maybe I'm gonna try teasing a little something new that's coming up for the podcast. I'm not gonna say directly what it is, but I think it's gonna be really fun, and we're just trying it out. I'm not sure if it's gonna stick or not, but we're gonna be launching a side podcasting project, and it'd be great if you guys listen to it. We haven't recorded it yet, but when we do, I will, maybe go a little bit more in depth, but just know that there is a new podcast project coming up. I'm very excited about it, and it'll just kind of be a fun side project to the best games, period. Because who else is going to tell you which games are the best games? Not some other podcast, period. It's going to be this one, period. The best games, period. Anyway, Stellaris is pretty good. It has some problems, but it's pretty good. And I recommend it to friends of the genre, to fans of the genre. Man, I am groggy today. Anyway, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. And we will be back next week with a full episode. Thank you for understanding why this one's running a bit late. I'm kind of recording it, editing it, and posting it all on the same day. So, a little last minute, but hey, Extra Life Game Day. It was important to do. So, again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the flippity dippity.
I said a long, long time ago, in a galaxy far away. Gather around, my little comets. I'm gonna tell you about the universe. There's nebula, black holes, supernovas. So, you better hop on the Enterprise. Better hop on the Enterprise. I said you better hop on the Enterprise. Cowboy Bebop space standing up in his mother father. Shake it to the left, barrel roll to the right. Bring it up above, we gon' boogie all night. Shake it to the left, barrel roll to the right. Barrel roll to the right, bring it up above, we gon' bring it up above. We gon' boogie all night, gon' boogie all night. Shake it to the left, barrel roll to the right. Barrel roll to the right, bring it up above, we gon' boogie all night. Shake it to the left, barrel roll to the right. Bring it up above. How you gonna be a space cadet? We'll get your asteroid supernova. How you gonna be a space cadet? Get your asteroid supernova. How you gonna be a space cadet? Or get your asteroid supernova. Just who the hell do you So are you gonna be a space cadet? Or get your asteroid supernova? And that's why I think I'd be a perfect candidate for Star Labs.